They say every country has ghosts, not the kind that rattle chains in the dark, but the kind that wear human faces, live in forgotten valleys, and vanish when the world finally notices them. In 1988, deep within the Annapolis Valley of Nova Scotia, investigators stumbled upon a truth so grotesque, so far removed from civilization, that even now, decades later, no one can say they've fully understood it. They were called the Goler Clan, a family so isolated, so entangled in its own bloodline, that the word family lost its meaning altogether. For generations, they lived high in the woods, cut off from paved roads, running water, or even the faint hum of electricity. Children were born, raised, and forgotten among trees that whispered more than any man ever dared to speak aloud. When social workers finally reached them, what they found wasn't just poverty. It was something primal, something ancient, as if time had stopped turning somewhere back in the 1800s and sin had grown roots. The Goler children, pale and frightened, told stories of things that made the room go silent, of nights when the line between parent and predator blurred, of homes filled with decay and the stench of waste and fear. Authorities thought they were rescuing the children from filth, but what they were really uncovering was a dark mirror held up to the rest of society, because what happened in those woods wasn't born from evil alone. It was born from neglect, generation after generation, ignored and left to rot by the very world that claimed to be civilized. And when the headlines finally broke, when the story of the Goler clan hit the evening news, it wasn't just a case of inbreeding or abuse. It was a revelation of how close horror can hide to home, how thin the skin of progress really is when left to fester in silence. People wanted to believe this was an isolated nightmare, something freakish, distant, safely foreign. But the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that the Goler tragedy wasn't a monster in the woods. It was a symptom, a reflection, and the question that began to surface was more terrifying than anything else. How many other families like the Golers had simply never been found? They called it a tragedy of isolation, but isolation was just the surface. Beneath the silence of the Annapolis hills, something else had been growing, something systemic, generational, and disturbingly human. When the first reports came in, officials thought they were dealing with neglect, malnutrition, unsanitary living, truancy. But the interviews with the children told a different story, one that shifted from sadness to horror. They spoke of fathers who were also grandfathers, of brothers who were also uncles, of mothers who bore children whose eyes looked too much like their own. The Goler family had lived so far removed from society that the meaning of family had twisted into something monstrous. Inbreeding wasn't just a rumor. It was routine. It had been happening for decades, possibly since the 1800s, passed down like a ritual no one remembered starting. But it wasn't the physical deformities or the genetic consequences that haunted investigators. It was the psychological toll. Generations who had forgotten the concept of outside judgment, who didn't know laws existed beyond their wooded world. To them, this life was normal. The woods were their walls, and the rules were inherited, not questioned. They didn't see evil in what they did, only survival. That's what made it so chilling. Social workers who entered their homes described floors littered with garbage, food scraps, and human waste. The children slept in corners on old rags. Some didn't know how to read. Many had never seen a schoolroom. Yet, amid this degradation, what terrified people most wasn't the dirt or the poverty. It was the complete absence of shame. The Goler adults didn't hide what they did. They didn't whisper about it. They spoke plainly, as though describing the weather. And that's when the towns nearby began to look inward. Because the Goler clan hadn't lived on some remote island. They were only a few miles from farms, from stores, from other families who'd heard the rumors for years. Yet no one intervened. No one climbed that hill. It was easier to pretend those woods were empty, to call it none of our business. But the silence of the valley wasn't ignorance. It was complicity. And once the truth came out, The question turned from, how could they live like that, to how did we let them? When the authorities began their investigation in 1988, what they found was not just a family, but an entire ecosystem of decay, a small community bound together by blood, secrecy, and the normalization of horror. The Goler Clan wasn't one single household. It was an extended web of nearly 40 people, scattered across shacks and trailers, tucked deep into the forest. Each generation was a branch curling back toward its own root. Police officers and social workers who walked into those dwellings described scenes that sounded less like poverty and more like abandonment by civilization itself. There was no running water, no electricity, no sense of time, only the slow crawl of existence, day after day, generation after generation, carved into the faces of people who had never truly lived beyond their valley. When they started to question the adults, the tone was almost casual. They admitted to the abuse as if it were routine, because for them, it was. One woman told investigators that her own father had started her when she was 8. She said it without emotion, without hesitation. Her children were in the same position she once was, and she didn't see a difference. It was all she had ever known. The children, though their eyes carried something different. Fear, confusion. A sense that something was wrong but no words to name it. When removed from their homes, many were terrified of the outside world. They didn't know what a bathroom was, or why strangers were giving them clean clothes. The youngest ones screamed to go back to the woods, to the same people who had destroyed their innocence. That was the hardest truth for many to accept. The children weren't rescued from monsters. They were torn from the only reality they'd ever been taught to love. Court records from that year revealed layer after layer of horror, rape, incest, assault, all within one family tree. And as each testimony was read aloud, it painted not just a picture of abuse but of a society that had turned away long before the police arrived. These were not people who had chosen darkness. They were born into it, shaped by it, trapped inside it. When the news hit the nation, it was easy to call them animals, degenerates, monsters. But for those who looked closer, a deeper horror began to surface, because what created the Goler Clan wasn't some mutation of humanity. It was neglect, passed down like a disease, ignored until it became unrecognizable. In the courtrooms of Nova Scotia, the truth finally had to speak aloud. It wasn't a single confession, but an avalanche. Each testimony pulling another loose from the darkness. The Golers stood before judges and juries, their clothes clean for the first time in years, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They didn't cry. They didn't plead. They didn't even seem to understand the weight of the words spoken about them. Incest, rape, assault, generations of it. As witnesses took the stand, the silence in the courtroom became suffocating. A young girl, barely a teenager, described how just happened, how she didn't know it was wrong. Another spoke about babies born who didn't live long. There were moments when jurors had to look away, not because of gore, but because of the emptiness, the sense that morality itself had been erased in those woods. The defense attorneys tried to explain what could not be justified. They said the Golers had been victims too, that this was not evil, but ignorance, that when you are raised in isolation, without education, without moral guidance, without society, the human compass breaks. And for a moment, even the courtroom hesitated, because if that were true, who was really guilty? The Golers or the world that abandoned them? Over a dozen family members were charged, with sentences ranging from a few years to more than a decade. But justice, in this case, felt hollow. How do you punish generations for a crime that began long before they were born? The system could lock them away, but it couldn't rewrite their minds, their memories, or their lineage. Some of the children were placed into foster care, others into institutions. A few vanished into anonymity, their surnames changed, their history erased. The trial made headlines across Canada and seeped quietly into American news. But what the public saw were only fragments photographs of shacks, headlines about hill people, and incest clans. It was easier to view them as aberrations than as evidence. Because if the Golers could exist, so could others, and perhaps still do. When the final sentence was read, one reporter wrote, "The Golers walked out of court not as criminals, but as proof of what happens when a society stops looking." And for the people of the Annapolis Valley, that sentence hit harder than any verdict. After the trials, the valley went quiet again, but this time it wasn't the same silence. It was heavier, haunted, as if the land itself remembered what had been unearthed. The shacks were torn down, the dirt roads sealed, and the forest began to reclaim what was left. But for those who'd been there, the social workers, the officers, the children who survived, the shadows didn't fade. They just followed them home. Many of the surviving Goler children were sent into foster care. On paper, they were rescued. In reality, many carried the trauma like a second skin. Some never adapted. They would wake up at night crying for a mother who had both loved and betrayed them. Others couldn't handle the sudden noise of the outside world. The hum of traffic, the buzz of electricity, the feeling of being watched by strangers. A few grew silent, refusing to speak for years. Reports later showed that many of them struggled into adulthood. Some fell into addiction, others into homelessness. A few returned to the woods, not to their family, but to solitude. It was as if civilization was too bright, too loud, too unreal after a life in the dark. Psychologists who studied their cases said the Goler children represented the collapse of social conditioning. Humans born without the moral or emotional frameworks most people take for granted. But for all the tragedy that came after, what unsettled people most wasn't what happened to the Golers. It was how easily it could happen again. Because as investigators looked deeper, they began to find patterns: other isolated families, other hidden communities, tucked into forgotten pockets of North America. Each one different in name, but not in nature. Poverty, abuse, silence, the same ingredients, repeating across generations like a curse no one wanted to name. For years after, people in Nova Scotia whispered about those hills. Some said you could still find remnants of the old clan, distant relatives who refused to leave. Others swore the land itself was cursed, that it had soaked up too much pain. But the truth is simpler and far more frightening. The Golers weren't cursed, they were abandoned. And abandonment, history has shown, doesn't die. It mutates, it hides, it waits for the next forgotten valley to bloom in darkness. By the early 1990s, journalists and sociologists began revisiting the Goler story, trying to understand how something so horrific could have lasted so long, undisturbed. They found decades of government files, reports of suspected neglect that were dismissed, welfare officers who noted unsanitary conditions but never returned, and neighbors who had seen the children scavenging for food but said nothing. The truth wasn't hidden, it was ignored. In interviews, a few locals admitted that everyone knew something was wrong up there on South Mountain. But they told themselves it wasn't their place to interfere. That, those people, had always been strange. It was easier to look away than to look too closely. Some even admitted to blaming the victims, saying the Golers were too lazy or too dumb to live like everyone else. The cruelty of that indifference ran deeper than anyone realized, because neglect doesn't just happen in remote places. It happens anywhere people decide not to care. The Goler case became a mirror for an uncomfortable truth. Civilization only exists where compassion does. Strip that away, and what's left looks disturbingly familiar to what happened in those woods. One sociologist described the Golers as a closed feedback loop of poverty. Each generation was born with less education, less opportunity, less exposure to the outside world, until survival itself became a cycle of repetition. Children learned from parents who had no framework beyond their own trauma. Abuse wasn't an act of cruelty, it was inherited behavior. No one taught them better, and no one intervened to stop it. But the media coverage twisted the story into something sensational. They became the incest clan, the Hill family, a freak show for headlines. Their suffering was turned into a warning about degeneracy rather than a lesson about neglect. The narrative of monsters was easier to digest than the reality of human failure. It made people feel safe, made them believe the Golers were something other than human, something they could never become. But the investigators who had seen it firsthand knew better. They'd seen how fragile the boundary between order and chaos really was, how quickly humanity can erode when no one's watching. One of them said years later, it wasn't evil that lived up there, it was emptiness. And emptiness grows fast when no one fills it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Years after the media storm died down, the Goler name became a ghost in the valley. Something whispered but never spoken openly. Reporters who returned to the region in the late 1990s found silence, resistance, even hostility. The locals didn't want to talk about those people anymore. Some claimed the whole story had been exaggerated. Others said the Golers had paid their price, and the rest should be left buried. But the ground never truly forgets what's been planted in it. One journalist, years later, tracked down a few of the surviving Goler children. Their stories were quietly devastating. One woman, living under a new name, said she still had dreams of her old home. The smell of smoke, the creak of the floorboards, her mother's voice calling her inside. She said that even now, as an adult, part of her missed it. Not the abuse, not the pain, but the sense of belonging, of family, even if it was poisoned. She said, when you grow up in hell, the flames start to feel like warmth. Another survivor refused to speak at all. He lived alone, on the edge of another small town, drinking heavily and working odd jobs. A neighbor described him as a man haunted by memories he can't name. The Goler children had been freed from their prison, but not from their past. They carried the ghosts with them, in their blood, in their dreams, in the silence between words. Meanwhile, sociologists continued to study the case. Some argued it was a failure of education. Others blamed generational poverty, still others the breakdown of rural infrastructure. But beneath every theory was a shared unease. The realization that the Goler story wasn't a relic of the past. It was a warning of what happens when empathy collapses, when society decides that some lives are too far gone to save. The valley today looks peaceful. The trees have grown thick. The air smells clean again, and the cabins are gone. But the past lingers like rot beneath new soil. Every generation that walks those woods walks over the graves of forgotten children. Children born into darkness not by choice, but by inheritance. And the most unsettling part, the Golers weren't unique. They were discovered, which means somewhere hidden between miles of rural silence, there may be others still waiting to be found. By the early 2000s, the Goler story had begun to fade from the public's collective memory. It was too disturbing to retell, too shameful to preserve. Textbooks didn't mention. The documentaries that were made aired once and were quietly forgotten. But for those who'd looked closely, the story never truly ended. It just slipped beneath the surface of history, where the darkest truths always seem to hide. Researchers who revisited the files noticed something chilling. Almost every warning sign had been visible decades before the discovery in 1988. Schools had reported missing children. Doctors had flagged medical concerns that were never followed up. Welfare officers had marked the family as risk as early as the 1960s. The system had seen the smoke, but no one bothered to look for the fire. One former social worker admitted years later, we didn't have the resources. But the truth is, we didn't have the will. That line echoed across every institution involved. Because the Goler tragedy wasn't just the story of a family. It was the story of bureaucracy turning a blind eye, of communities valuing comfort over confrontation. The journalists who covered the aftermath wrote about something they called the geography of shame. They said that every society has places it quietly abandons. Valleys, towns, or neighborhoods left to decay while the rest moves forward. The Golers were born in one of those places. And when you leave people in the dark long enough, they begin to forget there's a world beyond it. Some even questioned whether civilization is as strong as we like to believe. If empathy can vanish for one family, could it vanish for all of us, given enough distance? The Goler case became a haunting metaphor, proof that beneath our modern surface, we are still one generation away from collapse. A few survivors agreed to therapy and education programs. Some built quiet, ordinary lives, raising children who would never know the truth about where they came from. Others vanished entirely, their names erased by time and choice. But even for those who healed, the scars ran deep. Their trauma was generational, passed through memory and silence like an unspoken inheritance. And somewhere between those hills, between what was remembered and what was buried, the story of the Golers settled into legend. A dark reminder that when humanity forgets its weakest, something monstrous always grows in the dark. By the 2010s, a new generation of researchers, psychologists, anthropologists, and crime historians began to re-examine the Goler case with modern eyes. What they found wasn't just a historical failure, it was a pattern of human collapse repeating itself across time and geography. From the Appalachian haulers to the frozen edges of Alaska, from forgotten desert towns to rural Canadian valleys, the same ingredients appeared: poverty, isolation, shame, and silence. One researcher described the Goler tragedy as a slow motion extinction of empathy, not a sudden fall into madness, but a gradual erosion of connection, like soil washing away after too many years of rain. Each generation lost a little more of what made them human, until cruelty became ordinary and love became indistinguishable from control. But there was something else, something even darker, that emerged when investigators followed the story's echoes through other communities. They discovered that systemic neglect wasn't just about geography, it was about perception. Society sees what it wants to see. And for generations, no one wanted to see the Golers. They were written off as trash, as hill people, as unsalvageable. Once you label someone as less than human, their suffering becomes easier to ignore. Documentarians who revisited the valley decades later said the air still felt wrong there, thick with unspoken guilt. The locals refused to talk on camera, though some would quietly admit that what happened to the Golers could happen again anywhere people stop looking. It wasn't the land that was cursed. It was the apathy that infected everyone who knew and did nothing. By then, the last of the original Goler adults had either died or disappeared into obscurity. The children, those who had survived, were middle-aged. Many had never returned to the place they once called home. Some were still changing their names every few years, trying to outrun a past that clung like smoke. But when asked about forgiveness, one of them said something that stayed with me. You can't forgive what no one ever took responsibility for. That sentence cut through every academic theory, every report, every statistic, because behind all the analysis and moral outrage was a simpler truth. No one ever said sorry. Not the neighbors, not the government, not the nation that turned them into headlines and then forgot. And so the ghosts of the Goler clan linger, not as spirits in the woods, but as the silence we still allow when it's easier not to see. As the years passed, the story of the Goler clan transformed into something half whispered, half denied, a modern myth soaked in truth. The children who grew up from that horror became adults who had to learn, from scratch, what normal even meant. Some succeeded. Most didn't. The cycle of trauma doesn't break easily. It hides in the smallest gestures, in the tone of a voice, in the way someone flinches when shown kindness. Social historians who revisited their lives decades later noticed that the Goler tragedy had been treated like a contamination, something to quarantine, not understand. When the courts closed their cases, society closed the book. But trauma doesn't die when ignored. it mutates in silence. Some descendants still carry that weight without ever knowing the full story, because no one told them. No one wanted them to know. Their history was buried to protect them, and yet it shaped them all the same. One former welfare officer, years after retirement, gave an interview that was never aired. In it, she said, "We thought we were saving those kids from their parents. But the truth is, we didn't know what to save them to." That line lingers like an open wound, because what does rescue mean if there's no home, no healing, no place to belong afterward? By the 2020s, documentaries and podcasts started to resurface the Goler case. Not as a spectacle, but as a lesson. They called it Canada's hidden Holocaust of neglect. And through their retellings, people began to see that this wasn't an isolated story. It was part of a greater human truth. The thin line between civilization and collapse isn't drawn by wealth or education. It's drawn by empathy. And when empathy vanishes, the descent is quiet, invisible, almost natural. The woods where the Goler cabins once stood are now covered in thick moss and wildflowers. If you walked there today, you'd see no sign of what happened. No ruins, no markers, no trace. Nature, mercifully or cruelly, has erased it. But beneath that soil lies the echo of human failure, a reminder that horror doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers. And when you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint laughter of children who never had a chance to understand what innocence meant. Even now, more than 3 decades later, the legacy of the Goler Clan sits uneasily in the collective conscience. It's a story that refuses to rest because it was never truly resolved, only buried under shame, bureaucracy, and silence. The headlines stopped, the files gathered dust, but the moral wound stayed open. What happened in those woods wasn't an aberration. It was an exposure, a revelation of what happens when humanity looks away long enough for darkness to grow roots. When modern researchers try to map the psychological aftermath, they find something almost biblical in scale, a generational echo of pain stretching far beyond the valley. Some of the children's children, now adults themselves, struggle with identity, anxiety, and deep distrust of others, even though they were never part of the original nightmare. Trauma, it seems, doesn't need to be remembered to be inherited. It travels silently, through blood and behavior, like an old curse carried forward by memory's shadow. And what of the world beyond that valley? Did it learn? Did it change? Some say yes. New welfare systems were built, stronger child protection laws enforced. Others say no, because in the hidden corners of rural poverty, stories like the Golers still unfold, unreported, unseen. The only difference is that today, the world scrolls past them instead of walking by. Indifference has gone digital. There's a chilling detail few mention anymore. When the social workers first went up that mountain in 1988, they didn't go there because of a police report or a witness. They went because a single teacher noticed one child, filthy, frightened, and silent, and decided not to look away. One person. That's all it took to unravel a century of horror. And maybe that's the final truth buried beneath this story, that the only thing stronger than neglect is attention. That seeing someone, truly seeing them, can stop history from repeating itself. The Golers were lost because no one cared to see them. They were found because, finally, someone did. So when you hear stories like this, don't just listen for the horror. Listen for the warning. Because the next forgotten family is already out there, somewhere, waiting for someone brave enough to notice. Today, the name Goler survives mostly in archives and court transcripts. Cold words on fading paper, stripped of the human faces behind them. But if you stand in the Annapolis Valley at dusk, where the fog rolls low over the tree line and the air carries that deep forest hush, you can still feel something there. Not ghosts, not monsters, just the lingering weight of a truth too heavy to die. The story of the Goler Clan was never really about them alone. It was about us, about what happens when a society decides which lives matter and which don't. The Golers were easy to forget because forgetting made everyone else feel cleaner, safer, more civilized. They were turned into symbols, freaks, cautionary tales. But beneath that label were real children, real mothers and fathers, who lived and died inside a silence we built for them. Historians often call the Golers a failure of systems, but systems are made of people. Every unchecked report, every unvisited home, every shrug of, "That's just how they live," was a brick in the wall that trapped them. The horror of the Goler story isn't the incest or the violence. It's the slow, methodical indifference that let it happen in plain sight. And yet, out of that darkness came one fragile truth: it only takes one person to break a pattern. One teacher, one neighbor, one voice that refuses to stay quiet. The same blindness that created the Golers still exists, hidden behind politeness, class, and distance. But the same courage that uncovered them still exists too. So when we tell their story, it shouldn't be for shock, or pity, or spectacle. It should be as a warning, a mirror held up to every forgotten place, every neglected child, every family swallowed by silence. Because the line between us and them is thinner than we think. In the end, the Goler clan wasn't destroyed by evil, they were consumed by absence. And absence is something that never really dies. It just waits, patient and invisible, for the next place where eyes turn away. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all: the Golers were found once. But how many others are still waiting?